Israel will do its very best not to commit so-called war crimes while its enemy is daily committing war crimes
do not constitute and are not an appropriate response for other war crimes.
So these terms like international law or war crimes are thrown around a lot.
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is accusing Israel of war crimes.
Collective punishment of what is happening to the Palestinian people at this moment.
But the fact that there's so much disagreement to me means that we're probably not all that clear on what these things actually are or where they come from.
Do you believe that anything that Israel has done has amounted to a war crime?
Of course not.
Anybody who dares accuse our troops of conducting war crimes are people who are completely hypocritical, liars.
So I want to go over the laws themselves and look at, in no particular order, 5 ways in which Israel and Hamas have either definitely committed war crimes or at least committed actions that should be investigated as war crimes. Jus in bello, or international humanitarian law, is the law that governs the way in which warfare is conducted, and it seeks to limit the suffering caused, that is, by war and conflict. So international humanitarian law, reduce suffering as much as possible. So essentially you have under this customary international humanitarian law. This is the common core of international humanitarian law. It's not written, but derives from a general practice accepted as law. And then you have the Geneva Conventions, which are actually 4 treaties plus 3 additional protocols. But all you need to understand is that they are 7 documents, each one composed of a list of articles. So Geneva Convention, 7 documents. Taking of hostages. After Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, Hamas took about 200 hostages. So 2 things we have to look at here. 1, Hamas is not a country. This is not actually an international war.
If you think about treaties and then you wonder who is actually a party to the treaty and whether or not non-state actors are bound, they are. So Hamas does have international humanitarian law obligations.
And 2, let's look at the actual law that Hamas violated by taking those hostages. So let's go to the Geneva Conventions. Common Article 3, conflict not of an international character. This is basically the part that says it doesn't matter if you're not a country. Maybe you're just a regular old militant group. Doesn't matter. Article 3 says that non-state actors, like Hamas, can definitely do war crimes. And what is one of those crimes? Taking hostages.
Hostage taking is a really significant war crime.
Before we go forward, let's quickly go over something very important to understanding all of this. The principle of distinction and proportionality. Maybe you've heard those terms. The principle of distinction is basically the understanding that you have to distinguish between civilians and combatants. And you're only allowed to target combatants, obviously. So let's say you dropped a nuke on an area. Yeah, you'd probably kill the combatants, but you'd also kill all of the civilians. It's way too big a weapon to distinguish between the 2 groups, and thus, with the nuke, you have failed to apply the principle of distinction. There's also the idea of proportionality.
There are times in the prosecution of a war that there is a difficult decision to be made by military leaders about there will be civilian harms. Former military officials have said in the past that they have made this decision that the civilian cost is too high to continue to go forward with a particular military action.
Effective advance warning.
There is no military on the face of the planet, including the U.S. military, that goes to the lengths that the Israeli military does to avoid civilian casualties.
Okay, so you want to bomb this military target, but there are civilians nearby. So how do you deal with this? Well, you have to give advance warning to civilians to get out of the way. And that warning has to be effective, thus effective advance warning, because the idea is that you actually want to give people a chance to get out before bombs start dropping. So it doesn't count if the warnings are useless, and certain practices currently are questionable.
We also have issued concerns that just the blanket dropping of leaflets, forcing people or telling people to leave or they will be targeted, should be investigated as a war crime.
So in the Geneva Conventions, Protocol 1, Article 57 says, Effective advance warning shall be given of attacks which may affect the civilian population unless circumstances do not permit.
We had research looking at 5 incidents where we investigated civilian deaths and other attacks, and we looked at the quality of the effective advanced warning. And in all 5 instances, there was a flaw in that advanced warning. People didn't receive it, there wasn't enough time, people got unclear instructions, so actually where they went to be safe, it was where they were targeted. The time frame wasn't clear, so they evacuated and 5 hours passed and people wanted to go back and get their things so that they could leave. And when they went back to get their things is when the strike actually occurred.
Collective punishment. So soon after Hamas's attack on Israel, Energy Minister Israel Katz instructed that the water supply from Israel to Gaza be cut off immediately, adding that the flow of power and fuel was ceased 2 days ago. 70% of the population just in the south has no access anymore to clean water. The siege on Gaza, along with the blockade that had already been in place since 2007, amount to a couple things. One, it's collective punishment, which is a war crime. Because how can you punish an entire population and observe the principle of distinction? Obviously, you can't, since it's not just Hamas that can't leave or is being starved or having access to water restricted, it's everyone. So the prohibition of collective punishment is, in effect, found in customary international humanitarian law, but it's also explicitly mentioned in the Third Geneva Convention, Article 87, collective punishment for individual acts, corporal punishment, imprisonment in premises without daylight, and, in general, any form of torture or cruelty are forbidden. And the other thing is this: starvation. As an amateur military strategist, which we all are, I can certainly understand the utility in cutting off your enemy's food supply, right? Makes sense, starve them out. Fighting a war on a calorie deficit is probably pretty uncomfortable. So soon after the attacks, the Israeli defense minister announced,
"We are putting a complete siege on Gaza. No electricity, no food, no water, no gas, it's all closed. We're fighting animals."
This is a war crime. Cutting off sustenance and relief supplies to a civilian population is not allowed. And despite the fact that fighters are contained within the civilian population, depriving the entire population food or water fails to distinguish between civilians and combatants. And that distinction is everything. You can criticize a militant group for shielding themselves within a civilian population, but it doesn't change the civilian status of the population. Further, even if you want to argue that Israel is not technically or legally occupying Gaza, they control the supplies that flow into it, whether that's fuel or water or food or electricity. Therefore, they are culpable. Geneva Convention, Protocol 1, Article 54, starvation of civilians as a method of warfare is prohibited. Weaponry. Now, one person did actually suggest dropping a nuclear bomb on Gaza. Netanyahu suspended him. But there are other weapons that are also quite problematic. And the reason for that usually is that some of these weapons just cause so much damage or affect the area so uncontrollably that you can't apply the principle of distinction. So for example, white phosphorus.
White phosphorus is a bit tricky because there's actually legitimate military uses for white phosphorus. It can be used as like a smoke screen, essentially. Amnesty has put out 2 pieces of research on white phosphorus. So one just confirmed Israel had used white phosphorus in Gaza, and it looked at where they used it. We then put out new research, actually in southern Lebanon, where we were able to determine that the use of white phosphorus was in a heavily civilian population where you couldn't make a distinction, and civilians were killed in the usage of it. And so that's where we were able to say that there was a violation of international humanitarian law.
This is not meant to be a complete list and clearly doesn't cover all of Hamas's actions, which implicate multiple war crimes and almost certainly constitute crimes against humanity. But there's no serious debate as to whether or not Hamas committed despicable crimes. But there seems to be immense confusion as to whether or not Israel too has violated international law. Hopefully, this video helps clear that up a little bit, and it needs to be cleared up because large amounts of US tax dollars aren't going to Hamas, They are going to Israel, though.
The United States has given more military assistance to Israel in recent decades than it has to any other country. Since the State of Israel was established, it's $124 billion. That's not adjusted for inflation. But that does make Israel the largest cumulative recipient of U.S. military assistance since World War II.
And that will do it for me. Feel free to share this video with anyone who you think might be confused. But the other thing you should do is subscribe to Breaking Points. You can also find me on Twitter. Liking and commenting always help. Thank you to Breaking Points. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.